Let's talk about cannabis. Yeah.
Hey guys, Carolyn from Macroot and Extracts here. Normally this would be the start of a fun and informative video where you walked away hopefully feeling better. And I wish I could do that for you again today, but with the turmoil our country finds itself in, it feels wrong to not speak about this insidious force that has rocked us off our feet. This force affects damn near everything we do, think, feel, and buy. And like so many American industries, it has plagued the cannabis industry since its inception. If I'm being frank, we need to talk about it. It is racism. So let me run you guys through a little bit of history. When the transatlantic slave trade reached its peak in the late 1700s, early 1800s, there were no federal restrictions on the use, cultivation, or possession of cannabis, but there was an industrial need for the crop. This led to the earliest cannabis crops being grown and processed in Middle Kentucky by West African slaves. Now, if we fast forward to the end of the Civil War, the 13th Amendment passed by the House in 1865 officially abolished slavery. Sounds pretty great, right? Wrong. Because there was a loophole in the 13th Amendment that enabled slavery to still exist even today by condemning undesirables to a lifetime of legalized servitude. In the late 1800s, slavery was disguised as peonage or debt servitude. Now, slavery is just simply the American prison industrial complex. Let me explain why. Before slavery was abolished, our policing system was created for two reasons. In the North, it was to protect the Port of Boston from thieves and vandals. And in the South, it was to enforce the current slave system that was in place. The earliest police forces in the South helped construct the Black Codes. Now, these were early Jim Crow laws that established where and how formerly enslaved people could work, but also how much they could make. They also prevented Blacks from voting, living in certain areas, and traveling. But it gets worse. The legal system that enforced these laws were made up of judges and police officers who were a majority once Confederate soldiers. The same people who fought for their right to own a Black person became Black people's jury, judge, and executioner. Over-policing and over-incarceration led to rampant racism in small to medium-sized communities in the South. Eventually, Blacks from the South migrated to northern cities to escape their oppressors. This search for a brighter future backfired horribly because this would lead to white city dwellers demanding more segregation and oppressive laws preventing Blacks from becoming truly free. So birthed the new, widespread, strategically prejudiced Jim Crow laws that enabled the mass incarceration of Blacks and people of color by and for our private prison system. So getting back to our original topic, cannabis and Jim Crow really don't have a lot of direct connections to each other because cannabis was generally not used recreationally anyway until the 1920s. However, the Jim Crow laws that were originally only implemented by 10 of the 11 Confederate states between 1890 and 1910 eventually were adopted in some form by nearly 75% of all of the states. This means that the majority of the states had oppressive and racially discriminative laws in place preventing Blacks and people of color from becoming first-class citizens. So the groundwork is complete. The system set up for anyone wanting to exploit it. The easy part became figuring out how to perpetuate this system so only white people could benefit, because that's really what's at the heart of all of this, am I right? Cue Harry Anslinger. This dude, a first-generation Swiss-German immigrant, propelled the historic campaign associating alcohol, drugs, and cannabis with, you guessed it, immigrants, and later Blacks. In 1910, Mexican immigration to the U.S. spiked due to the Mexican Revolution. Keep in mind that this was happening in the midst of prohibition in the U.S., so already alcohol, cannabis, and opiates had become commonly associated with the Mexican culture. when Anslinger got bored as the assistant commissioner for the Bureau of Prohibition. He decided to dip his grubby little fingers into the world of narcotics, and in 1930, he became the head commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. So Anslinger didn't have a lot of bad things to say about cannabis at first. In fact, Anslinger said in 1933, "There is probably no more absurd fallacy extant than the notion that murders are committed and robberies and holdups carried out by men stimulated by narcotic drugs." At the time, keep in mind that cannabis was considered a narcotic. Anslinger's problem was not with narcotics themselves. His problem stemmed from who was using narcotics. Opium was associated with Chinese, heroin with black islanders, cocaine with rich whites, and cannabis with Mexicans, and later blacks. Ironically, Mexico banned cannabis in 1920. So during an 18-year period between 1920 and 1938, Mexicans were purchasing cannabis in the U.S. and transporting it back to Mexico, not the other way around. But this didn't faze Anslinger, though, because there was already a strong association with dangerous Mexicans and cannabis. All he had to do was sprinkle a little bit of sensationalism. 4 years after claiming that narcotics wouldn't cause someone to murder or rob, Anslinger begins to change his rhetoric. Suddenly, this man makes claims like young people are slaves to this narcotic, continuing addiction until they deteriorate mentally, become insane, turn to violent crime and murder. So wait. So this dude who claimed 4 years prior that cannabis isn't a threat to the public is now saying that it will cause you insanity and to go on a murdering spree? Yeah, I smell bull. Anslinger knew that he needed to make more money for the Bureau in order for it to continue, and it simply wasn't enough using cocaine and heroin. He saw a massive opportunity in cannabis, which had become much more widely used by the late 1930s. So the first step was controlling the narrative. The rhetoric he chose to use laid the foundation for a massive campaign to criminalize cannabis use in Black and Latino communities. And in 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act was passed. But this act didn't completely outlaw cannabis. No. This simply made it astronomically more expensive to consume, distribute, and grow cannabis in any form. So the elites could buy and use weed all they wanted because they could afford it. But the people who couldn't afford it, predominantly people of color, if we remember that Jim Crow laws were still in place preventing financial prosperity in the Black community in general, they were fined or thrown in jail for the possession and distribution of cannabis. If that wasn't enough of a slap in the face, let's talk about Reefer Madness. So Reefer Madness was originally a sensationalized film made to display the detrimental effects of cannabis. Now, the film was funded by a church group hoping to educate their community on the dangers of the drug, but it soon was used in damn near every public school in America to strike fear into the hearts of students and their parents. It is an hour worth of nonsense. And if you haven't seen it yet, don't. Or do, but don't say I didn't warn you. The film caused a chain reaction that is still affecting our society today. Fear was just the beginning. Anslinger needed specific groups of people to be the faces of cannabis. Who better than the Mexican immigrants and the Blacks? Anslinger all of a sudden starts saying like this.
Marijuana is the most violence-causing drug in the history of mankind. Reefer makes darkies think they're as good as white men. You smoke a joint and you're likely to kill your brother. The primary reason to outlaw marijuana is its effects on the degenerate races.
Anslinger made these statements during the jazz era, and at the time, Black folks in the music industry were pretty outspoken about their marijuana use, so there was already a cemented association with Blacks and cannabis. Anslinger sensationalized this association by saying,
Their satanic music, jazz and swing, is a result from marijuana usage. This marijuana causes white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes, entertainers, and any other.
He played on people's fear. He played on their ignorance, and he used a system that was so strategically planned, there was no way of disrupting the trajectory. I know I gave you guys a lot of information, but this topic is multidimensional, intersectional, and deeply rooted into our society. To explain one thing requires me to explain another concept and another and another. The main focus that I hope you guys walk away with is that almost every industry in America has roots in racism. The cannabis industry is absolutely no exception. This video is not used to insult you or to make you angry, but it is encouraged that you do something about it and that you are aware of the situation. I hope this helped you guys understand the depth of this systemic issue. Stay tuned for part 2, and we'll connect the historical information with our current reality of the cannabis industry and how it is still heavily influenced by 200 years of conditioning. Be safe out there, my friends. I encourage you to do your own research using the links below. And as always, get inspired to be a better you. See you guys next week.